This car should have disappeared decades ago. Experts doubted it. The world around it collapsed. And at one point, the factory that built it was sitting in the ruins of a war. Yet somehow, this strange little machine went on to become one of the best-selling cars in human history. More than 21 million were built. But the real story isn't about the car. It's about how a project that almost died multiple times somehow conquered the world. This is the story of the Volkswagen Beetle. In the early 1930s, owning a car was still out of reach for most families. Cars existed, but for millions of ordinary people, they were simply too expensive. Most manufacturers focused on customers who could already afford private transportation. The average worker had very few options. That created a problem. If cars were supposed to transform society, why were they still unavailable to most people? Across Europe, engineers and manufacturers searched for a solution. A vehicle that could be affordable, reliable, simple enough for ordinary families, and cheap enough to be produced on a massive scale. It sounded simple, but creating such a car would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. By the mid-1930s, the idea of an affordable car for ordinary families had become a serious engineering challenge. The requirements sounded almost impossible. It had to be affordable. It had to be reliable. It had to carry multiple passengers, and it had to survive long-distance travel on the roads of its time. Most importantly, it had to be built at a scale that few manufacturers had ever attempted before. Engineers experimented with different designs, different engines, different body shapes, different mechanical layouts. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Instead of placing the engine in the front, designers moved it to the rear. Instead of sharp edges, they chose a smooth aerodynamic shape. The result looked unusual, almost strange. But hidden beneath that simple appearance was a design philosophy that would eventually help define one of the most successful cars ever built. Designing the car was only half the challenge. Building it would require something even bigger. A factory capable of producing vehicles on an unprecedented scale. The vision was ambitious. Entire production systems had to be planned. Supply chains had to be organized. Infrastructure had to be built from the ground up. An enormous manufacturing complex began taking shape. Railways connected it to the outside world. New facilities appeared around it. Everything was being designed around a single goal: mass production. The project was no longer just about a car. It was becoming an industrial ecosystem. And for a brief moment, it looked like everything was going according to plan. Then, everything changed. The factory had been built. The designs had been developed. Production plans were in place. But the world was moving toward one of the largest conflicts in human history. As Europe descended into war, priorities shifted. Resources became scarce. Factories changed roles. Entire industries were redirected toward wartime needs. The dream of producing an affordable car for ordinary families was suddenly pushed aside. Instead of becoming a symbol of mobility, the project entered a period of uncertainty. Years passed. The factory survived, but the future of the car itself became increasingly unclear. By the time the war ended, very few people could have predicted what would happen next. When the war ended in 1945, the future of the factory looked bleak. Much of Europe was rebuilding. Infrastructure had been damaged. Industries were struggling to recover. And the automobile project that had once promised so much now seemed unlikely to survive. Some observers believed the factory should simply be dismantled. Others saw little value in continuing production. After all, the car itself was unusual. Its design was unconventional. Its market was uncertain. And there were far bigger problems facing post-war Europe. For a moment, the story of the Beetle almost ended before it truly began. But then, something unexpected happened. A small group of people looked at the factory and saw opportunity where others saw failure. That decision would change automotive history forever. In 1945, the project received a second chance. Production restarted. Not at a massive scale, not with grand ambitions. Just enough to keep the factory alive. At first, output was extremely limited. Resources were still scarce. Equipment was outdated. And Europe was still recovering from the devastation of war. But something important happened. The car worked. It was simple, reliable, and relatively easy to manufacture. As more vehicles left the factory, confidence slowly returned. Orders increased. Production expanded. And what had once looked like a failed project began turning into a real business. The Beetle wasn't winning people over with luxury. It wasn't winning people over with performance. It was winning people over because it did exactly what it promised to do. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Volkswagen faced a new challenge. Building cars was one thing. Selling them internationally was another, especially in the United States. At the time, American roads were dominated by large automobiles, longer cars, bigger engines, more chrome, more power. Compared to those vehicles, the Beetle looked almost out of place. It was smaller, slower, and dramatically different from what most American buyers expected. On paper, it shouldn't have worked. Many imported vehicles struggled to gain traction in the American market. The Beetle seemed destined to face the same fate. But once again, people underestimated it. What happened next surprised almost everyone. Instead of trying to compete directly with large American cars, Volkswagen embraced everything that made the Beetle different. The company didn't pretend the Beetle was luxurious. It didn't pretend the Beetle was powerful. And it certainly didn't pretend the Beetle was the biggest car on the road. Instead, the message was simple. This car was practical, affordable, reliable, and honest. At a time when many advertisements focused on size and status, the Beetle focused on simplicity. The strategy worked. Young drivers embraced it. Families embraced it. Students embraced it. And gradually, the tiny foreign car that nobody expected to succeed became one of the most recognizable vehicles in America. The Beetle wasn't just selling cars anymore. It was building an identity. But no success lasts forever. By the 1970s, the automotive industry was changing. Consumer expectations were evolving. Technology was advancing. New competitors were entering the market. The Beetle remained popular, but maintaining the same formula became increasingly difficult. Volkswagen began introducing newer vehicles designed for a different era. Gradually, attention shifted. Production continued for decades, yet the automotive world that had created the Beetle no longer existed. Finally, in 2003, production of the original Beetle came to an end. After nearly 7 decades, the journey was over. Or so it seemed. Back at the beginning of this story, we said the Beetle should have disappeared. And in many ways, it probably should have. It survived economic uncertainty. It survived war. It survived changing industries. And it survived generation after generation of competitors. Few vehicles in automotive history have experienced a journey quite like it. What began as an ambitious attempt to create an affordable car for ordinary people eventually became a global icon. More than 21 million original Beetles were produced. Its shape became instantly recognizable across continents. Its influence stretched far beyond transportation. And decades after production ended, people still recognize it immediately. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the most advanced, but because it solved a problem millions of people shared. Sometimes the most successful products aren't the most complicated. They're simply the ones that arrive at exactly the right moment in history. And that's what made the Volkswagen Beetle one of the most important automobiles ever built.